Good morning, all. Thank you all for joining. Or I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, shouldn't I, really? That's the usual intro to these things. But yeah, appreciate you all joining. So we'll make a start as we are on time. So my name's Luke. I am the Microsoft practice lead at CyberOne. I can see some familiar faces on the call. So just very briefly, my background is pretty much entirely in Microsoft. It's where I started my career. And yeah, I spent a good couple of years there, 8 years in total, working as an engineer and architect in Microsoft. Hence my focus on that part of the cyberspace. This presentation is, or this webinar rather, is all around identity security. There is a focus on Microsoft throughout this, and I'll call that out where it's relevant as well. But yeah, without further ado, I will continue on. So, for those of you who've attended my webinars before, I always like to give out some statistics at the start of the session, and this is going to be no different. So, this data has been pulled from the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. So, this is a yearly report that Microsoft publishes. Includes all kinds of information. It's usually well over 100 pages long. So it's the kind of thing you might open and try and find particular bits you're interested in. I've picked out some of the identity specific bits of information, and I'm going to just run through those as a bit of an intro for us. So this first point here, I suppose, is more generic. So again, all of this, keep in mind, this is data from Microsoft, so it's their view of the world. But the first point I want to raise is 600 million cyber attacks observed per day across Microsoft's product suite, across their infrastructure. That's a very, very large number, sure we can all appreciate, right, per day. Pretty crazy numbers, and that theme is going to continue. We're going to keep seeing some interesting things come up. So focusing in on identity, there's around 7,000 password attacks blocked per second. Again, I'm going to emphasize that. So per second across the Microsoft world, they are blocking 7,000 password attacks. And that was across the years 2023 to 24. And I expect that trend is only going to increase, right, as cyber becomes more and more prevalent. As we hear about it more in mainstream media, that's because it is a growing and ever-evolving industry. So this kind of stat is likely only going to get worse. Good that they're blocking it, by the way, but just bad in the sense that there's a lot of attacks happening. Now, the next one, again, really, really critical. So 99% of identity attacks are password based. I'm going to expand on this one a bit later because I think defining what I mean by password based is quite important. But just remember that 99% figure because we'll come back around to it shortly. This next one, pretty worrying. So what Microsoft have said is that, they are on a mission to achieve 100% MFA adoption. And currently, as of their last digital defense report, that is at 41% across enterprise organizations. So in the Microsoft world, enterprise organizations are anyone with 300 or more employees. So not necessarily that large when we think of that kind of threshold. And yeah, to say, 40% is currently where we're at, that's pretty low, right? That's a far ways off 100. It's a lot lower than I thought it would be. So I was quite surprised to see that number. And again, I will talk about MFA as we go on today. And then the last thing down here, so again, this is something I'll define a bit more clearly later on, but password-only authentication results in more than 99% of identity compromise. So that's to say that if I do not have MFA enabled, then that means I'm using password-only authentication. So the only thing that is validating whether my user is who they say they are is the password. That's very bad because according to Microsoft, 99% of identities that are compromised are because they're only using one factor or the password. So again, something really important to keep in mind as we go through today's session. Now, there's a really nice quote in the Microsoft document. So attackers don't break in, they log in. I think this is very pertinent. Yeah, it sounds kind of cool. It's quite a snippy way to say it. But I think the reality is it is very, very accurate. So there is a couple of questions coming up on screen, by the way, so please join in with those polls. We'll try and loop back around to those as we go through the material today. But yeah, it's important to understand that because, back in the day, it was kind of seen that attackers would break into a system by performing some really complicated, highly confusing attack. The reality is that just isn't the case, certainly nowadays anyway. They are accessing organizations ultimately by logging in. We know from the retail attacks that happened a few months ago, M&S to pick on them, they were breached through a third party, TCS, right? That is public knowledge. Ultimately, the attacker was able to gain access to Marks and Spencer systems by logging into a TCS user's identity, right? So they didn't necessarily break into anything. They just did an ordinary login, and that was enough to give them access. So, really, quite a nice quote there. And just on the more positive side, so I think this is really interesting in green. So Entra ID, which is obviously Microsoft's identity solution, has over 900 million monthly active users. Again, some crazy numbers there. Now, the reason that matters to us is from a cyber perspective, just the sheer telemetry that Microsoft are capturing around identity threats, identity risks, password attacks, lack of MFA, all of these things. That telemetry is incredibly powerful. That allows Microsoft to continually evolve their detection mechanisms to prevent, malicious actors from breaching your credentials. So that is really huge, and that is only a fraction of Microsoft's total telemetry, right? That is just the Entra platform. Never mind their Defender suite or Sentinel or anything else they have. Cool. So I like a good diagram, and I think this is a really nice way to visualize what happens in a typical sort of identity compromise life cycle. So the attacker starts up at the top there, the initial identity compromise. Now, phishing tends to be the way in, but we also see brute force and password reuse. I'll go into detail about those a bit later. From there, the attacker, once they've compromised that original credential, they will then move to around your organization to see what other platforms can they compromise. So we're probably familiar with the term lateral movement or lateral traversal. So the attacker's got that one identity. They're now going to try and use the access that gives them to reach other systems. Now, this could be another user, it could be a device, it could be an application, it could simply be to interact with some data that is important. It could be any of those things. From there, once they've expanded their initial attack, maybe let's say for argument's sake, they've compromised now a user and that user's device. So at this point, it's a fairly simple compromise. There isn't that much to it. But that middle, sorry, the stage down at the bottom there, internal reconnaissance. So the attacker now, okay, I can now access that user's mailbox. I can see what data that user has on their device, or maybe in their OneDrive or SharePoint access as well. And what I may also do is look at building in a persistence technique. So persistence meaning if the attacker was to be discovered, they will have developed a couple of mechanisms so that they can re-enter the organization should they be kicked out or detected. And that's something that a more sophisticated attacker will certainly do. And then the final step on the left-hand side, so resource access. This is now where the attacker is likely starting to weaponize their behavior. They're starting to compromise more sophisticated systems, things that are more important to you. Could be cloud services, cloud applications, on-prem servers, on-prem apps, whatever it may be. They've now increased their access across your environment. And notice that this is a complete loop. So it is a cyclical process. The attacker will just repeat this over and over again, ultimately growing their footprint in your environment, compromising more and more assets that you hold until they're eventually able to execute their mission, which may be data exfiltration, it may be sabotage, could be a number of other things as well. So this kind of endless loop is the rough order that an attacker will go through when performing an identity-based compromise. Just some key takeaways from this. I touched on it there, but once the attacker's inside, they can just repeat this process until they achieve their mission. Of course, we should have ways to detect the attacker here and ultimately respond to their behavior. But if we don't, then there's nothing stopping them just continuing this process. I mentioned the persistence techniques, so that just allows them to re-enter the organization. What I should also say is that this isn't limited to the cloud only or the on-prem only. This affects hybrid organizations. So a compromise of an on-prem system can lead to a compromise of your cloud and vice versa. what we mustn't think is that there's some kind of magical barrier between our hybrid organization. Ultimately, if the attacker ends up within part of our network, they will ultimately be able to traverse our organization and reach other parts of our network. So, unless we have some air-gapped network set up, then this is always going to be true. Now, just to expand on this kind of way of thinking, let's think about what is the modern workplace, and some of the risks that come with that. So we are hyperconnected. Access is no longer limited to full-time employees. So we will have contractors or other temporary members of staff. We'll have partners, suppliers, and some of you will also have customers that, buy products or buy services directly from you. And all of those user types will be interacting with your systems. Any one of those accounts to be compromised could, in principle, lead to a compromise of your whole organization. So that widespread connectivity ultimately increases the complexity of our organization. But perhaps more important, in the sense of cybersecurity, it increases the complexity of keeping ourselves resilient against cyber attack. So the next thing along, the attack surface is ever evolving and ever expanding. So evolving meaning it is becoming more dangerous, and expanding meaning it is increasing. As we adopt more of a cloud-first mindset, as we have hybrid environments, we have these modern working practices like work from home, bring your own device. We have more third parties and partners engaged. This means that things are more complex, as I mentioned before. And ultimately, that means the attack surface gets larger. And the larger it is, in principle, the more threats that we are vulnerable to. It's also to say that, the old school way of thinking is long out of date. So that perimeter security mindset, which unfortunately some organizations still kind of follow, is just not accurate anymore. I'll be covering that in more detail shortly. But identity is very much the new security perimeter. Lastly, then, so again, unfortunately, many organizations still have a kind of legacy view of trust. And what I mean by that is that once a user has authenticated, then we essentially just trust them. We say, well, they've passed that first check. We'll just allow them access to whatever they need. That is no longer good enough because, as we learned on the previous page, 99% of attacks are password based. And the similar fact was that 99% of attacks target organizations that only use passwords, so they don't have MFA, for example, meaning that if a user is compromised and that user has broad and very permissive access across our whole environment, well, there's a high likelihood that's going to end badly for us. So we can't just trust things. We need to have a kind of what you might call a zero trust approach. That's something we'll be touching on shortly. So I mentioned around the fact that identity is very much the new security perimeter. So let's just reflect on the old school way of thinking. So the traditional perimeter, you can kind of think of it as a castle and moat design. So the moat would be your trusted internal network. The actual walls of the castle would be your network firewall. What you would then do is bring all your assets, all your soldiers, all your royalty and whatever inside the castle. That would be your users' devices, your applications. And then if you're lucky, you may actually decide to apply some antivirus to those assets as well. And in the old school way of thinking, this was pretty much security, right? You have a network, you put a firewall on it, and then you use antivirus. And that was pretty much as far as organizations would go. Even 5 years ago, this was still true. It is all outdated. What we need to think of is the modern identity perimeter. So identity becomes the center of the diagram, the center of the visualization. So off of this identity kind of main point here, we have again employees, contractors. We've got our customers. We also have devices. Now, devices, importantly, nowadays, it's not just a computer in an office chained to a desk. It's a laptop. Could be a BYOD device as well. Could also be a mobile phone or a tablet. And those things we need to consider as well. We've also got, we may have some of our traditional on-prem apps, but nowadays we're all pretty much hybrid or perhaps even cloud first. And we'll also have some cloud applications in the mix as well. And then finally, partners and suppliers. So I mentioned the Marks and Spencer breach. Obviously, that was a supply chain compromise. That's very important as well. So these are the major components of that identity kind of first way of thinking. So you may have a combination of of these. You may have all of them. You may have four of them, for example. Doesn't really matter. This is the way to think about identity security as it is today. So now we've kind of set the scene. I want to move on to the actual risks. I briefly touched on these, but again, want to have a nice visual to speak about it. So going back to our interesting statistic earlier, so more than 99% of identity attacks are password attacks. Now, I will define what that is shortly, but first I want to just talk about that less than 1% because it does still matter, and I think it's also quite an interesting couple of pieces in here. So less than 1% of attacks now make up this purple section. Let's keep that in mind. So MFA attacks, two examples would be SIM swapping. This is where an attacker will, so let's say you've got a user who's registered their MFA to their mobile. It's registered to their unique mobile phone number. What will happen is an attacker will contact the SIM provider. They will impersonate that user and they will say something like, "Oh, my phone's been lost or stolen, therefore I've lost my SIM card. Can you transfer my mobile number over to a new SIM card? Can you send me one in the post?" Ultimately, the support engineer or whoever it is in your mobile carrier's support team has just been socially engineered. They say, "Yep, sure, okay, I will send you a new SIM card." That gets sent to the attacker. And what will now happen is the actual user's MFA will effectively now be in the hands of the attacker. So if that user receives a phone call or a text message to validate their MFA attempt, that is now going to the attacker's mobile phone and not the user. So this does happen. It requires the attacker to socially engineer your phone provider, but it is still a thing to be concerned about. The next one, MFA fatigue attacks. For those of you who use an authenticator app in your personal lives, and I hope all of you do, you'll be able to see this for yourself. So I use the Microsoft Authenticator, as you probably won't be surprised to hear. There is a history page within the Authenticator. So I can go on my history, and I'm not joking, there is hundreds and hundreds of MFA attacks against my personal credentials every day. And this will be the same for probably all of you on the call. So if your email address has ever been involved in a breach historically, which again, probably all of us have had that happen, that will be publicly available. And what that means is an attacker will simply try and authenticate against your email address. They may just try loads of random passwords. Doesn't really matter. That's still an authentication attempt. And that will then trigger historical record in your Authenticator app to say, look, there's been an attempt here to trigger that MFA prompt. Now, Microsoft and other, MFA authenticator app providers do an amazing job of just hiding this from us, so we don't really see it, but it is happening constantly. If we think about that in our personal lives, the same idea translates to the corporate world, right? This is continually happening. We learned before that there's thousands and thousands of attacks blocked by Microsoft every day, every second even. It's no different. So these things are largely being prevented automatically by the vendors that we trust in, but there is still that less than 1% that sneak through, and that's why we end up with some of these purple blocks. Another example is what's called a post-authentication attack. So the clue's kind of in the name here, but ultimately, let's say a user logs in. They've logged in a normal way. They've successfully passed their MFA challenge, whatever it may be. The user themselves is not compromised, but the thing that they have logged into is compromised. So everything's gone well, largely. But unfortunately, now the user's authenticated, it's after the fact that their credentials are stolen. So again, not a frequent thing, but something to be aware of. And then finally, infrastructure compromise. So this is kind of that older school way of thinking. So back in the day before kind of the cloud first mindset, Active Directory was obviously the primary identity provider for most organizations. That would have more sophisticated attacks performed against it. You may have heard of pass the hash or pass the ticket, golden ticket, skeleton key. These kind of things are what I'm referring to when we think of that more traditional infrastructure compromise. And much less prevalent nowadays because I should say all of these things are less prevalent because there is easier ways for the attacker to compromise you, and that's what the 99% is that we're about to learn about. So I've just brought up a little bit of text in the orange circle there. I won't read through it all, but essentially these attacks happen because they are easier to pull off. It's as simple as that. So the first one, breach replay, very, very common. So let's say a compromise has happened last year and some of your users' credentials have been stolen in that attack. Fast forward to today, the attacker is now going to reuse those credentials to access your organization. So if you don't have a way of protecting user credentials, ideally through a passwordless approach, and I'll touch on that later, it's possible that a previous compromise or a compromise of another organization could actually be used against yourself. What we also need to consider is that if we are allowing our users to sign up to applications just willy-nilly, um, if that application was compromised, it's the same problem. So, the attacker steals our credentials from some cloud application that we're all using. They can reuse those credentials against their organization. And guess what? They will know your domain because they will see the user's email address, which, could be, anonymous.com, for example. So, next one, password spray attacks. This is essentially a brute force method where the attacker will use common passwords and will just try and log in with them. Nothing more complex than that. Still very prevalent because it works. We may think that our user base is sophisticated. Unfortunately, there will still be users in your organizations using password 123. They will be using the company name as their password. They may use the address of your head office as their password or the year the company was founded. All of these things are very, very common, right? People also use their own birth dates. They use their favorite football team or the city they were born in or the city they live in. And all of these things can be easily socially engineered or just found online via LinkedIn, or via your company website with very minimal effort required from the attacker. And this is the kind of thing that they will use for password spray attacks. The last one here, probably the most significant of all of them, phishing. Unfortunately, humans, as we were kind of learned here, are the most fallible, right? The systems themselves are very, very good. It's humans that make mistakes. And phishing has been and will continue to be one of the most prevalent ways an attacker gains initial access because it's easy to trick people. If I send an email to the finance team, impersonating the CEO saying, I need this invoice paying immediately, do it right now or else. Someone in the finance team may go ahead and click on that link, download the file, and without realizing it, they've now caused a compromise of the organization. Now, it's just one simple example. There is obviously endless examples of way phishing can be pulled off. So again, these orange ones, this is how 99% of attacks happen. So we should be protecting ourselves against everything on screen. But if we've got limited resources, limited budget, we should focus on the orange ones because that's where you'll get the most return on investment. So now we've learned what the actual kind of primary attack techniques are. I want to touch on some of the causes of these things. So a common one would be excessive permissions or privilege creep. This is where either standard users or privileged users have more access than they need. This is very, very common. I've mentioned there in the sort of third, second bullet point down, principle of least privilege. This is the idea that we give a user the bare minimum they need to do their job. So anything excessive breaks this rule. This idea is, if all they do is open a particular Excel file, enter some data into that, and that's their whole day, then we should only give them access to that Excel file in principle. That's the idea. Now, obviously, people's jobs are more complex than that, but we can extrapolate that idea and think about it more broadly. Um, we should also think about just in time, which I will touch on in a couple of times today. So I'll move on from here for now. Another one very prevalent, again, retail attacks. I won't repeat myself, but unmanaged supplier access, very, very key. Unfortunately, this is a very common route in because let's say your organization is very secure. You follow all the correct principles. You've got a very locked down environment. You take security very seriously. You've got dedicated resource. You've got a 24 by 7 SOC detecting and responding to threats. Loads of investment in security. But unfortunately, one of your suppliers doesn't have that same mindset. They invest very little in security. They maybe have no dedicated security personnel at all. Maybe they've got no IT team and they just don't care about it. If I was an attacker, am I going to attack you directly or am I going to first compromise your supplier and use that as a way to breach your organization? I think it's fairly obvious. Shadow IT, huge. So this is an example of this is where users may use their corporate credentials to sign up to a cloud application. We need to be preventing this behavior because essentially, the way to think about it is the more of our corporate credentials are spread out across the internet, the more random applications people are registering to, the more likelihood, the higher the likelihood, sorry, it is of a compromise occurring because our credentials are just spread out more, right? Our attack surface is larger. So we really need to be restricting what our users can register to. And if they are allowed to register to a third-party app, we need to be controlling the behavior of that via MFA or some other, additional challenge or additional step in the authentication process. Inadequate governance. So again, super important. This is where we may have user accounts from 5 years ago that are still active in our environment. Why do we need that? We simply don't, right? So if a user leaves the business or they change roles, we need to automatically be either disabling or deleting that account or automatically migrating them from one set of permissions and access to another. So having an automated joiners, movers, leavers process, very important. Ultimately, if that is set up correctly, it needs very little administration and it will do everything right. If you set it up well, it will do everything to a good standard. It removes human error, right? So we may have our own IT teams in-house. If they're manually having to manage joiners, movers, leavers, it's not very fun, right? It's a pretty boring task. They're likely not going to pay that much attention to it because it's just not that interesting. They're also likely to make an error, right? We're all fallible, we all make errors. And all it takes is that one account to be somebody to forget about it, and that account has loads of permissions. Nobody's monitoring it. People, that person left the business 5 years ago. We don't even know what their job was anymore, right? The business has moved on, but their access and permission is still there, leaving a dangerous kind of vulnerability just lingering. So again, very important. Okay, so those are just an example of risks. Now, this is obviously not a complete list. These are some of the major ones that I wanted to highlight. And just from here, I just want to briefly talk about regulation. So I'm not going to go into any great detail here. We will have a data security webinar upcoming in a couple of months where I'll go into this stuff in more granular detail. But just from an identity perspective, if we think of GDPR, Article 5 of GDPR has a particular reference to unauthorized access. I'm not going to read through the quote, but just a reference that GDPR does specifically call out identity as part of its requirements. Those who work in the healthcare sector, HIPAA, again, explicitly calls out identity as part of, the access and authorization for user data, healthcare data. ISO 27001. So Annex A has a total of 93 controls, and there is a selection of those that are identity specific. So it talks about segregation of duties, privilege access. There's also stuff in there about remote working. All of this, again, relevant to identity. And then lastly, PCI DSS. So any of your organizations who manage payment card information, there is a specific requirement, requirement 8, that very, very clearly articulates two principles around identity and also has 6 kind of subsections which have a number of kind of individual requirements that again are specific to identity. So this is just 4 sort of different regulations, frameworks, compliance things to keep in mind. It's fair to say that pretty much all of them have an identity component. So some of these will be relevant to you on the call, some of them won't be, but this is just to get you thinking about why identity really matters. Okie dokie, so zero trust, another buzzword, but it is very important to understand how identity comes into the zero trust conversation. So here is my lovely diagram. Let's say it's the Parthenon, right? It's that good. What I'm showing you here are the 6 pillars of zero trust. Now, I will say there are different models around what zero trust looks like. This is the Microsoft approach, and I am very biased, but I'm inclined to agree with their approach. So these are the main components that make up zero trust. Now, it's no accident that identity is the first pillar there on the left-hand side. It's also no accident that networks is the final pillar. I would say the first and sixth pillar there are perhaps the most important elements of zero trust. But what I want to say is that identity makes up a key part of this, right? If we were to remove that identity pillar, the whole thing falls down. I'm sure many of you understand what zero trust is, but I will talk about the principles just to make it clear. So the first principle of zero trust is verify explicitly. This is where rather than just saying, okay, we just trust people, they've logged in, that's great, we'll just allow them access. We're going to make sure that when we authenticate them, that we're also checking their authorization. So authentication being you've proved who you are, authorization being you now actually have access to this particular thing over here. So a particular file, for example. So we verify explicitly. We use all possible data points to understand, is this person who they say they are, and do they have the correct permissions to access the things they're trying to access? So this is where we use dynamic risk and other more modern approaches to identity to start to do this explicit verification. We also then apply the least privilege access idea. This is where, so I mentioned the principle of least privilege earlier. It's very much related to this second point here, but also so is just-in-time access. So both of these things form a huge part of it. The idea is that we give people the bare minimum they need to do their job, and we limit it by some kind of time-bound control, so that if an admin needs to elevate their privileges, we'll allow them to do that, but only for a specified period of time. So if I need to be global admin of my tenant, I can request those permissions, but after 4 hours, they're going to be automatically removed from my account. And if I need them again, I have to request them again. And then the third principle is assume breach. This is an idea that's been around for a long time, even before zero trust was kind of coined as a term. Assume breach or assume compromise. The idea is, unfortunately, we need to take a pessimistic mindset. So the idea being, well, it does what it says on the tin, really. The idea being that either we will be or we have been compromised. And I think it's really important to understand that, again, I'll repeat it, you will be or you have been compromised. Okay. It's very possible that right now some of your organizations could be compromised. And if you don't have a way to detect that, how would you ever know? More than likely in the future, if your organization hasn't experienced a cyber incident of some magnitude, you will. It's essentially a guarantee. And we have to think in this pessimistic way because that changes our mindset. It makes us understand the importance of security. If we know as a fact we will experience a cyber incident, well, we better start protecting ourselves. Otherwise, we know we'll be compromised. So, zero trust is a really large topic. I just wanted to reference here that identity is a key part of it and just make it very clear as to why that is. So hopefully that's helped people visualize and understand the zero trust argument. Okay, so I've given you a lot of information, and I want to talk about sort of proactive security and what we can actually do to achieve a zero trust approach to identity using the Microsoft tools available to us. So these are only 5 recommendations. Obviously, this is not everything. It's just what I can include in a relatively short webinar. So the first one here, this is not a simple recommendation. It will take a fair amount of time to get to this point for many of you. What we want to do actually is retire passwords completely. So what that means is moving to a passwordless approach. This is where nobody logs in with their username and password anymore. They use some other method to authenticate themselves. The way that we do this in Cyber One is with Windows Hello. So that is a really great way to do it. I would argue it's actually more user friendly than having to type out an email and password. You can simply log in using your face, right? If you use Windows Hello, you can use your fingerprint as well or a PIN. All of them are equally secure. I'll try and avoid getting into the weeds, although I'm very tempted to start explaining how Windows Hello works, but probably doesn't matter for for this conversation right now. But what we need to understand here is that we do not want people using passwords because people fall into bad habits. Like I said before, they use their favorite football team, the place they were born in. If we then make them reset their password every month, all they will do is add a number to the end of it. So I'm from Liverpool. If I want to say my password is Liverpool, and I just, every month I add a one to the end of it, we get Liverpool 1, Liverpool 1 2, Liverpool 1 2 3. That's not a very good password, and that is the trap that a lot of people fall into. So we want to just avoid the use of passwords entirely. Windows Hello is a really great way to do that, and many of you will have the right technology already to start looking into it. FIDO2 passkeys is a alternate approach. More complicated. There will be an initial investment there of buying those physical passkeys. The passkey is a little USB-sized device that you use as a second factor. It's probably the most secure way of doing passwordless authentication, but there's a cost. It's also possible to lose the passkey, right? People could drop it. So there is that to consider, but it's one of the options there. Now, as an extension of moving to a passwordless approach, what we should also do is just outright block any legacy approaches. There's a couple on screen there, so IMAP, POP, and SMTP. The reason they're legacy is they're so old that they bypass MFA. You cannot MFA a authentication request that is going across one of those protocols, so we just do not allow them. They are very bad. There's other examples beyond those three, but those are some of the obvious ones. Number two, conditional access. So conditional access is a fair beast in and of itself. Not quite as complex as the number one recommendation there, but it does require time investment, requires a good understanding of how conditional access actually applies its policies. So just very briefly, it applies the policies effectively simultaneously. So for those of you familiar with group policy from the olden days, um, group policy, it applied policies in a particular order. There was a preferential order in which different rules were applied. Conditional access is not like that, to be clear. Conditional access evaluates every policy that the user is in scope of, and it is the total sum of that evaluation that determines whether the user can log in or whether their access is blocked, or maybe they just simply have to pass an additional check. Part of conditional access, we can look for device compliance. We can look for what network the user is connected on. We can look at the risk on the user object. We can look at risk on the individual sign-in event, and a number of other kind of controls can be included. And what we want to make sure is that anybody who's an administrator has a more stringent level of controls than a regular user, because of course, if I was an attacker, I'd really like your admin credentials. So protect those more than a standard user. Okay, so PIM is the next one. So privileged entity management. PIM is the Microsoft solution that allows you to perform just-in-time administrative controls. What this means is that, like I said before, if I want to be a global admin, rather than being permanently a global admin, I can elevate my privileges through a request. And if that gets approved, I can then be a global admin for, let's say, 4 hours. After that time period, my permissions are removed. That's the idea of just in time. It's a very, very important piece, and it's actually quite easy to implement as well. Next one, again, pretty chunky one. Not going to say this is easy. We need to really stringently control our B2B and B2C identities. So B2B being business to business, B2C being business to consumer or customer. The idea is that when we are engaging with individuals outside of our organization, we need to make sure that any controls applied to those external users are very, very strict indeed. Ideally, we need to be using something called access packages within the Entra suite. An access package is the idea that if I've got a supplier or partner or a customer, I need to give them access to 5 different things. The access package will allow me to define what those 5 things are, and anything outside of that access package is simply invisible to these external identities. So it requires a fair amount of upfront configuration, but once in place, very, very powerful because it allows us to give external users access to our systems, but very, very granularly control what they can access. We can also do some time-bound controls on it. So let's say we have some contractors in to do a project for us. We know the project end date is December the 1st. We can make it so that the access package expires on the December the 2nd, so that everything is removed post completion of that project. Next one down. So identity lifecycle management. So I touched on this earlier. This is where we have an automated joiners, movers, leavers process. So fairly straightforward. Well, I say straightforward. It's not necessarily easy, but the concept, I hope, is simple. So I've just laid out 5 recommendations. Now I want to kind of talk about some quick wins. Some of them are related to the previous slide. Some of them are new things here. So just to bring them up. I'm not going to go through all of them one by one because I will just go through some examples of how you can actually do these things. So rather than just telling you about them, I'm going to show you how you can do it. Some of these are quicker than others. I'm defining a quick win as something that can be in principle done within less than 30 days. Some of these could be done with a day of effort. Some of them will require a couple of weeks, to be clear. Feel free to take a screenshot, by the way, if you want a quick snippet of this. So I will move on to sort of I wouldn't call this a demo, but it is just a way for me to show you and visually describe some of these recommendations. So the first one is around MFA enforcement. So we're going to use conditional access here. Now there's 2 things that we need to do, which are highlighted in orange. One of them is we need to set up an MFA registration policy, and the second is actually enforce MFA. Now, I would argue this MFA registration policy is perhaps one of the most important steps we can take in the conditional access space. Now, it doesn't look like much, but what this policy is doing is it is defining the conditions for a user to register their MFA credentials. So their phone number, their authenticator app, whatever it may be. What we can do is we can say, okay, well, I've got a new user joining the business. I need them to register for MFA. What's the most secure way for me to mandate that for them? Well, ideally, they would do that from a corporate device on a corporate network, perhaps. So that's 2 separate controls I'm requiring. So that would mean the person comes into our office, right? They get given the laptop on the first day of work. So that's the corporate laptop box checked. And because they're in the office, they'll be connected on the corporate network. With those 2 conditions met, I will allow them to register their MFA credentials. If for some reason one or both of those conditions is not true, then I will not allow them to register their credentials. Now you may think, well, that sounds bad because I need them to be, registering their MFA details in order to obviously MFA challenge them. The logic is that if we do not have these controls in place, if a bad actor could ultimately compromise the account, and then the bad actor could register their MFA credentials instead. Because if that bad actor is based half a world away, they won't be on our corporate network and they won't have our corporate device in their hands. And that would mean they could, in principle, register for MFA on behalf of one of our users so that when that user tries to access a system, the bad actor can simply approve their own MFA request at that point. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. So it's very, very important that this is done and done in a sensible way. Now, once we've got these parameters for those initial registration details, we can then look at a second policy, which is actually enforcing MFA itself. Now, there's loads of ways you can do this. What I'm showing on screen is just a very simple example. Like I said, this is not particularly nuanced what I'm showing you here. I don't know what your organization does, right? I don't know each of you individually necessarily. I can't make a personalized recommendation. So all I'm showing you is these are some of the basic steps we could take to register and then require MFA for our user base. So important kind of first steps here. Now, what I will talk about in the second quick win is conditional access more broadly. There are, to my count, 18 unique conditional access templates. Now, these are very, very good because they will give you a huge head start in actually deploying the right types of policies. So from the Entra Admin Center, just go over to conditional access, and up at the top there, you'll see create a new policy from templates. This will open up a second screen that looks something like this. You can see the one in red I highlighted because it's actually what was on the previous screen. So I've cheated myself here and fast-tracked things. Rather than manually creating your conditional access policies, which may be a bit confusing and intimidating, we can simply use the built-in templates and they will do exactly what we need them to do. You'll notice there's a few categories across the top: secure foundations, zero trust, remote work. There's a number of policies spread across these categories, so what you're seeing here is not all of them. Um, Simply, we select the policy we want. We can then essentially copy that as a template, and it will just work out the box for us. So this is not a new feature, but it's something that a lot of organizations do not leverage. So if you're thinking, yeah, we don't really do a great deal in conditional access, maybe it could be better, just go and look at the policies. They're basically going to tell you what you should be doing, so you can just copy them and immediately, enhance your security with little time investment. Just to show you what it looks like, when you view the policy, it just basically gives you a slightly different looking page that just describes what the policy will do. You can now go ahead and then create it from that template. Now, because it's templated, you can go ahead and edit that. You're not restricted to only using what the template provides. You can customize things. And also you can have a combination of templates and custom policies as well. So you can have a mix and match. The final quick win that I want to talk through then is just in time. So we talked about PIM earlier, privileged identity management. Again, steps on screen to reach this part of the portal. What you can essentially do is individually assign users a particular administrative role in Entra, and that will allow us to do a couple of things. So you can see here, I'm going to give Boris global admin permissions. Nice and easy, just a wizard, a couple of button presses, and I can give him the necessary permissions. However, this second box on the right-hand side, this is where we want to focus a bit of our effort. So we've got up at the top there, you've got assignment type. Would we like Boris to be eligible to be global admin or to be active as a global admin? The difference is if somebody is active, they are permanently given the global admin permission. This is bad in the context of global admin because it kind of defeats the point of using PIM. Ultimately we're saying, okay, Boris is global admin 24/7. He doesn't need to be 24/7 because he will be sleeping and not working, but we're going to give him it every hour of every day anyway. That's not a good idea. Active does have its use cases. It's best used for reader permissions. But when we're assigning an actual admin permission that has some kind of control, yeah, we should be using eligible. Now, eligible has a couple of sub options that you can see down in the bottom half of that screenshot. Eligible is the idea that Boris can become a global admin, but he has to go through an approval process first. So when Boris logs in on his morning routine might be to log in, do a couple of admin things, check his email, but now he needs global admin permission to do something more severe. Maybe there's a support ticket open that he needs to troubleshoot. Boris is going to go to the PIM interface. He's going to see his eligibility for global admin and he's going to activate that eligibility. What will then happen is one of two things. Either it will be automatically approved or a human will have to approve that request for him. Either way, assuming that request is approved, Boris is then given global admin, but only for a specified period of time. And we can decide what that time is. It could be 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours. It's up to us to customize that in the back end. So that customization can be done per user. It can also be done at the permission level. So I can actually customize the behavior of the global admin role itself. Or I could individually customize what Boris can do, what Bob can do, what Luke can do. Again, high level view here. I will promise you that if you're not using PIM, it is a relatively low effort way to improve your control around admin permissions in the Entra space. And I will say that any of the quick wins or any of the recommendations that I've given out, um, like I said, some of them are genuinely very quick to do. Some of them require more time investment. I'm happy to have a conversation, so feel free to take my details down and send me an email afterwards, and I'm happy to give you a bit more detail specific to your organization. Like I said, this is all fairly generic at this point. So with that said, we've reached the end of what I wanted to talk through today. Just to close ourselves off, just wanted to highlight that, we do regularly do webinars. Typically, we aim for one or two a month. But in September, you're lucky because there's three webinars or three events happening, I should say. So the first one on the left-hand side is an incident response webinar. You'll have two of our very experienced team on that one. Unfortunately, it won't be myself, but you will have our head of cyber defense and our incident response practice lead there talking you through incident response and talking about crisis and how you handle all of those challenges. In the middle, so if you're a partner of ours or if you are a new partner looking to engage with us, we're actually having an in-person event, a partner launch event based in London. So feel free to attend that. And then finally, on the far right-hand side, I will be talking you through Microsoft Purview. So similar to the way that I've talked about Entra today, I'll be talking you through Purview and all of the important things that you need to consider when it comes to data security. That session, Purview is a beast. There's going to be a lot of information in that one. It's going to be pretty jam-packed. I won't lie to you. So bring your thinking caps for that one. But if data security is an important topic for you, which I suggest it should be, yeah, you will learn a lot about Purview, some of the risks, some of the ways you mitigate those risks in that session. So feel free to visit our website and register for these things. And yeah, with that, I will say thank you. I appreciate all of your time. And we will look to close off the session. I will just check if there are any questions or comments or anything like that lingering around just before I officially wrap up.
Oh, we just got one from Melissa here. One moment.
Sure.
Melissa, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was looking for the clapping emoji.
No worries, no worries.
Sorry.
I do have one, by the way. It's quite an interesting one, actually, and one we hear quite a lot, Luke. And that is sort of how can smaller organizations more effectively adopt zero trust without the large comparative budgets that enterprise organizations do? And now I think that could be a long answer, but any just top level ones there?
Yeah. So I guess I'll just flick back to that zero trust slide while we're here. But what I would say is, if you've got a Microsoft Business Premium license, for example, it doesn't really matter what license you have, but you have the technology for each of these pillars. Okay, so you've got Microsoft Entra ID, you've got Intune, you've got things like Defender for Cloud Apps if you have the security add-on, you've got Microsoft Purview, there are networking capabilities in Entra. That they aren't necessarily best in class, but they are there. And then on the infrastructure side, some of you may have an on-prem, some of you may not, so that one's slightly more nuanced. But for at least four and a half of these pillars, let's say, the Microsoft tech that you currently have can bring you towards that zero trust approach. Okay, so your current investment can get you a lot of the way there. So I would start by looking at some of the things I talked about in today's session on the identity front. On the device side of things, start looking into Intune, start looking into compliance policies. If a device becomes non-compliant, we should be blocking access until it becomes compliant again. That is a zero trust idea. On the application front, we should be blocking applications that we do not want users to be accessing. We should be explicitly have an allow and block list. That should be for applications installed on devices, but also cloud applications. So there's two angles to consider there. From a data perspective, I mean, this one's pretty obvious, but if people don't have a reason to access customer data or financial data, PII, whatever it may be, we simply do not allow them access to it. And we also need to make sure that we've got robust DLP controls in place so that even if the wrong person accesses the data, we prevent them from exfiltrating that data. So those are just some really high level thoughts. But just to reiterate, your Microsoft investment as it stands today can get you a long way towards zero trust. So that would be the area to focus on. And I will say that if that's something that you need clarity on, bit more detail on, specific to your organization, just reach out to the team. We'll be happy to engage. I'll be happy to have a conversation with you about kind of the broad steps you need to take to get to that zero trust sort of zenith. But yeah, there's a lot to that one, Mark. So I'll leave it there for now.
It sounds like another webinar in itself. So
Yeah, it
yeah, I
probably
think that's
is.
it.
Yeah, probably is. You could do a whole hour on zero trust. Okay. So I think we'll call it quits there. So thank you all for attending again. Thank you for staying on for the question and answer bit there too. Like I said, if you've got any further thoughts, feel free to reach out to the team and we'll be happy to engage. And with that, enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you for your time.